We decided that we really wanted to bring a really authentic conversation. Not that our other conversations aren't authentic, but we wanted to take a look at something that's very personal for us both and explore it. And I think if I could preface it a little bit, what I'd say is that given the nature of 2020, given the nature of the work that we do, the field that we're in, you and I have both been in really deep conversation about the power of authenticity and the power of vulnerability. And not only that, but this phenomenon of the dark night of the soul. And it's something that I learned about very recently. I think I had heard the idea and the concept kicked around in various circles, but only in the last 2 years did I really become intimately involved or curious about what is the dark night of the soul. And so, TJ, I thought what we could do tonight to start this conversation is if you could give what your understanding of the dark night of the soul, or define it for the people joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And I'm gonna actually start with what it's not to me, because sometimes I hear people saying, "I just went through the dark night of the soul," and what they're talking about was they just went through a difficult time, or they went through a time of some sadness. And although that can appear to be very dark, and we can experience that as very dark, when we're talking about the dark night of the soul, we're actually talking about when our consciousness is transforming and we're shifting into a higher awareness or a greater state of being, we're elevating our consciousness. And I'll just put it really bluntly, the shit that isn't working so well from the old life needs to crumble and fall apart so that we can actually move into the transformative power of what can get created when we're willing to actually lean in and experience everything that we're going through. Now, another definition of dark night of the soul, which I think is important to bring too, is many of us have an awareness of our spiritual nature, or we feel very comfortable on our spiritual path, or we have a very deep connection with each other and with ourselves spiritually. And we go through an experience that we might consider like going through the desert or the wilderness, where we lose touch with that. We feel lost, we feel hopeless, we feel disconnected, we don't know where to turn. That's another aspect of dark night of the soul, and I hear it described that way as well. What I'll say is, in my experience, which I know we're going to talk about, it's actually both of those. Dr. Wayne Dyer says every spiritual advance I've ever made was preceded by some kind of fall. So that's what we're really going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what happens when our world falls apart, what happens when we raise our consciousness, and we need to actually address some of the parts of our lives that have been trapped in the shadow. Because honestly, what happens with Dark Night of the Soul is all of the stuff we've been burying comes to the surface so that we can heal it. And sometimes it can be extremely messy. And in my case, it was very messy. And I have stories I could tell, and I'm willing to tell any of them. But in my case, I think the transformation was really big, and so was the circumstances, the experience, and even the drama of that experience of me walking through that dark night of the soul. It was really profound for me, and it was also really painful when I was in the midst of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you and I had been in conversation about this previously, about working with ego and detaching from this idea of who we are. And, I remember very clearly, I was in a conversation with you and the great Temple Hayes. And before we went live, she said, "Jeremy, how you doing? How you been?" And I said, "Well, Temple, it's this really weird thing. I woke up and I don't really know who I am anymore." And she said, "Congratulations, honey, you made it." Right. And it took me a while to really understand what she meant by that. And I think that it's going to be a lot of fun for us to explore exactly what that is tonight. And so with that being said, one of the things that I've noticed is that when we tell the story of conscious recovery, when we tell the story of how it came to be, oftentimes you'll share about early childhood and um, the blade of grass and being amazed and full of joy and wonder and curiosity, and then eventually growing up where you did and how you did, putting up a wall around your heart. And so many people have heard that story. They're so familiar with it. And you and I have been in conversation much deeper than that about your entire journey in recovery and where conscious recovery really came from. And you would share with me about your dark night of the soul. And I found that story to be so deeply meaningful and powerful because it was so raw and vulnerable. And so I know that some people that are familiar with our work and have read your books may be familiar with it, but I was hoping that tonight what we could look at is um, really your dark night of the soul, what it looked like, what the experience was, and then, of course, the transformation that it helped launch into existence. So, if you could take us to the beginning and share
Yeah,
what it was.
absolutely. And so, as you said, so many people are familiar with my story where I talk about coming into this world feeling very open and connected and in awe of the world. And then I had an experience called being born on planet Earth that caused me to shut down and build a wall around my heart. And then I found relief from that with drugs and alcohol. I got sober, and the recovery has been about reconnecting with that true nature. Now, that sounds really nice, but it wasn't so beautiful and linear when I was going through it. So, what happened for me, and I'm going to say for me very consciously, is I'm going to talk about it from the time I was around 20 years sober. And the years that led up to the experiences of my dark night of the soul were this. I had opened a business. I had, in some ways, started to re identify with my ego rather than my true nature. So even though I'd had these spiritual experiences, and even though I'd been in recovery for a long time, and even though I had been in the New Thought teachings for a long time, there were still some aspects of myself that I had not addressed yet. I had buried it very, very deep in my shadow. And so another way to say it is I had forgotten the truth of who and what I am. And when I think about causing harm to myself and others, which I've done a lot of in my life, it has always been because I had forgotten my true essence and I was believing in the ego, right? I was believing in the role I was playing or the personality I was playing. So I had this business. I felt oh so fabulous. I had the house on the hill. I had a very handsome boyfriend. I had the new Lexus, and I was really in all of that. And I was feeling emptier and emptier inside. And I just kept trying to achieve more on the outside to somehow heal something on a very deep level that hadn't quite been addressed. So again, I was 20 years sober. I had all of these things that had already been going really well in my life. And here's what really happened, Jeremy. So I'm setting the stage for that because I started getting the calling to become a spiritual teacher. At the time, it was to become a minister at Unity, a New Thought. And honestly, I pushed it down. I was like, no way. I love my fabulous life. I am not going to do that. I'm not going to give into that. And it was a year before I finally even put voice to it, to a good friend of mine who was a minister at the time. And she said, well, get ready, because once you say yes to this calling, anything unlike it will need to crumble. And I was like, oh God, oh, okay, right. And I remember at that point, I had enough of myself and my journey to realize that when that deep knowing of who I've come here to be, when that voice is coming up, I need to yield to it, right? So the other thing that was happening at that time, for example, with my business is I just kept getting deeper and deeper in debt. And I just kept thinking the solution was to be even more fabulous, to look even better, to buy even more clothes. And so I was in this really interesting place of feeling empty inside again. I'm like, wow, here I am again, feeling almost like I did when I built that wall. And my solution was outer focused again. Now, some could say, well, I was in an addiction. Yeah, absolutely. We could easily say that. And my addiction at that time was look goodism, right? I needed to look good. I needed more clothes. I needed the car. And this pattern of this outer seeking was so prevalent at the time. And Like with my business, for example, I was getting deeper and deeper in debt, but I would not acknowledge it. I wouldn't let anyone see that. I wouldn't let anyone in. I wouldn't let people really see what was happening. And I'll tell you why. Shame. I had
Mm.
a lot of shame at the time that had not been addressed. And so when I had the calling to go into ministry, when I had the calling to become a spiritual teacher and an author, these visions were coming through. As that became a yes for me, I realized, now some of this was conscious and some of it wasn't, but I realized that I was going to have to address the way I was living my life. Now, I could have probably at that point done it in a really clean way, but instead, everything really fell apart and it became really messy. And there were a lot of people harmed, myself included, and other people. And it ended up with me having a bankruptcy, losing my house, losing my business. My partner left me, losing the car. Everything came crumbling down. And on top of that, there was a rumor mill going around about me. And as I like to say, some of it was even true. A lot of it wasn't, right? And here's why I'm bringing that into the story. There was the greatest opportunity for me to really understand the human ego, and to understand what was happening was pushing up against my ego, because I found myself wanting to defend myself. I found myself wanting to tell my version of things, right? And then I realized that spiritually, what really needed to happen was for me to lean into it. Now, that's the beginning of the dark night of the soul. And we can talk a little bit more about what it actually looked like. But I did enter into a really dark time. And that dark time was not knowing who I was anymore, losing the identity. Everything that I had clung to, all my look goodism, it all crumbled. And I had an opportunity to move into that pain, obviously be accountable for what I had done, which was a big job. And there was more to it than just what I'm telling you. But to clean all of that up as best I could. And at the same time, realize that it's not the truth of who I am, and that all of that was being shed so that I could move out of a life that was really lived very deeply in ego or personality and tap more deeply into spirit. And it was a multi-year process. It was very, very difficult, but ultimately transformative.
Yeah, and I love that because sometimes in recovery or even outside of recovery, what we hear culturally, the narrative is, like all over Instagram and social media, you hear about people talking about difficulty and how it's a mental game. You have to do what you don't want to do and go to the gym anyways and keep your diet in and be disciplined, and that's all good and great. Um, but I think the disconnect is viewing this deep pain as an opportunity, because when we're in that deep pain, the last thing we want to hear is somebody come along and say, wow, like what an opportunity,
Right.
right? Because it so does not feel like an opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, if we were to rewind the clocks back to that time of your life, when you were in this deep suffering, this detachment from personality and ego, um, could you tell that there was an opportunity there?
Yeah, so here's what's interesting about it is there's a term in New Thought called chemicalization. And chemicalization is when your consciousness raises to a level that is vibrating at a frequency higher than the way you're living. And what happens is it causes the chemicalization or the change in your life, and things begin to fall apart. Now, the reality is I knew what was happening even in the midst of it. I was aware of what was happening, was that this stuff needed to be faced finally, that I needed to actually look at myself and look at the patterns that I had developed, or what we call in conscious recovery, brilliant strategies. The brilliant strategy was looking good. The brilliant strategy was not letting anyone in. The brilliant strategy was pretending like I wasn't in all this debt. I have to keep looking good. I have to keep doing this show. So I actually knew when it was crumbling. I was aware of the opportunity. And not only was I aware of the opportunity, I was aware that what was happening was chemicalization in the dark night of the soul. So I was fortunate in some ways to actually lean in and feel it, because I absolutely understood at that point that I was either going to address it. And when I say address it, I don't mean in the outer realm, I mean address it internally. I'm going to have to make friends with this. I'm going to actually have to lean in and look at those parts of myself that I had been avoiding for 40 years. The shadow, the shame, the difficulties, the behavior. And it culminated in me being in my house for 72 hours with the curtains closed and me saying, I will not leave this place. I will not leave this place until I have the breakthrough. And the breakthrough was painful. It was tears, and it was ultimately realizing that that ego sense was dissolving. And it doesn't mean my ego left forever, but what did happen was my relationship with my ego changed at that moment, and it's never been the same.
And so, yeah, and that's one of my favorite parts of the story is the fact that you locked yourself in your room and really leaned into that stuff. I found so much inspiration in that. And, for people watching or listening that may not have a lot of familiarity with ego and ego work and things like that, when you say that you detached from ego and you were part of that process and that it never went away, but you brought this new awareness to it. What is that in layman's terms? If somebody, because I mean, like TJ, so many people have reached out to us over the last year and a half. We've experienced it ourselves, this deep pain, this suffering. And a lot of times, for us, it's different in a way because we have this kind almost like clinical or spiritual even understanding of what's at play. But what about for the people that don't know what's going on?
Well, I also want to, and we can bookmark it, but I want to talk more because it sounds like the way I said it, like things crumbled, things were difficult, and then I leaned in and had this beautiful experience. But there were 2
Yeah.
years where I struggled. So I want to come back to that. But what we're talking about is a recognition that I have thoughts, but I'm not my thoughts. I have a personality, but I'm not my personality. I have an identity, but it's not who I am. The role that I play, the facade that I've built, the points of view, the perspectives. What happened to me, and I had an experience in India in 2006, which was a profound awakening where I realized very, very deeply that I had been living my life based on believing that I was my opinions and my point of views, that I was separate from, that I was better than, or that I was less than, or that I was different from. And I had this profound oneness experience that changed everything. And I became aware of reality. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the timeline, that's not where the drama ended at all. It intensified after that because I had the awareness of what reality really is, that love is the truth of who and what we are, that oneness is the true experience, and that the division and separation is a function of the ego. It was stripped away for about an hour, and I really legitimately could only see the oneness and feel the oneness. There was no separation between me and another person. And then I pulled out of that, and my ego immediately came back in and took charge. And I actually it's interesting because there was more damage that was created in that year that followed it. And then the 72 hours happened where I realized I'm going to have to address this. I'm going to have to address this in the outer realm and the inner realm. And, sometimes stuff doesn't go away. Pema Chodron says, life will continue. This is a paraphrase, by the way, but life will continue to present itself until we get the lesson, right? We'll re-experience something until it teaches us what we're intended to learn.
I love that. And I think, going back to that 2 years of pain, because I think you're right that it is important to note that this isn't like a week-long process. It's not like you go to a retreat here in, Monterey Bay and, go through this pain and then you come out this beautiful effervescent self. Maybe that's true.
Yeah.
But I think what's important to note is that 2-year chapter. And I also think it's really interesting that after that experience of oneness, your ego almost came back with this intensity of like, no, that can't be.
Yeah.
Because I've experienced something very similar myself. And so in looking at that 2-year period, Walk us through that. What was that like? What was going on
Yeah.
in the 4 rooms?
Yeah, so I had lost the business. The partner had left. I'd lost the house. I'd lost the car. I went into this really intense period of time where I was looking within and what really matters here and what is the truth and how do I clean up the wreckage that I had caused and how do I look at like the things that are being said about me and looking at the truth and the untruth of that and looking at how I wanted to defend myself and then go into the spiritual perspective of none of that really matters because it's a story that people are perpetuating. And then I had the experience in India and I realized, oh my gosh, there's a deepening that is being required here. And there was this profound experience of what I tapped into, what a possibility for life was, that I could live beyond all the divisions. And then the ego came back in. And then I thought, oh, I have a good idea. I'm going to open a second business. I have a good, so then the ego came back in and I ended up selling the business to my best friend and it went really, really badly. And then he claimed I defrauded him and it became this legal thing. And then it became a story in the media. And oh my gosh. And I was in my ministerial studies, I'd completed 5 years of ministerial training and I had so much shame. I had so much shame because look at the mess I've created in the midst of this awakening. And there weren't very many people talking about it at the time. There weren't people saying, yeah, because I had this awakening, the chemicalization happened, things fell apart. I had an opportunity to lean in at that moment, but no, my ego came back and said, no, I'm going to go back to the facade. I'm going to try that again. So if someone's watching right now, have you ever had the experience where like, oh, finally, I have peace with that. I'm no longer going to act that way or do that. And then a week later, it's like, oh, there's that part of you that wants to come back in and do it. And that was where the real dark night of the soul came in, because I realized very, very deeply that what was happening was a result. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying I'm not accountable for what happened. It was a result of the behavior of my ego. My behavior was harming myself and others. And I did have to clean that up. But I realized that it was all happening because there was a surrender, a much deeper surrender being asked of me. And I had an opportunity, because just having everything fall apart doesn't mean we're going to transform. Mm-hmm. It means there's a doorway. There's a doorway into a new way of being. And then that 72 hours that I often talk about was really about this idea that I was a victim. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to be really honest with you, Jeremy. There was a group of people that had a lot of judgment, and this group had some power over me, and they had the ability to affect my ability to do what I thought my life's work was. Mm. And I was projecting onto them, and I was in this story, and I decided I was going to write an email, and I wasn't going to leave my house until the email was the deepest reality. And so the first email I wrote, and thank God I didn't actually hit send, because it was like, I decided that I'd be in the total victim story. How dare you do this? And she said this and they did that and blah, blah, blah. And all this stuff is being said about me. And let me tell you what's true and what's not true. And I just did that. I let my ego write this email. And luckily I didn't send it. And then I slept. And then I woke up the next day. And when I woke up, I did my meditation. And in the meditation, it said, remove everything. This was the voice from within. Remove everything from that email that was simply a point of view. I'm like, what does that mean? Right? It was almost like there was this voice guiding me in remove. Basically what it was saying was take out the ego, right? So I'm like, okay. So I started looking at everything I'd written. I'm like, well, that's just my point of view. And that might be because of an old wound I have from childhood. Well, that's just, I think she said that because someone told me. So I don't know if that's true. And it started whittling down to deeper and deeper awareness of what is true. And then I woke up on the third day and I went to the email, and the email that I actually sent was, thank you. I love you. Thank you for participating in my transformation.
Wow.
Because the reality is I had created all of this, what we call earth drama. My ego, meaning me, part of me, my personality self, had created all of this, and all they were doing is reacting to it. And all I could do was finger point. Mm-hmm. Just like I was projecting, they were finger pointing at me. And the one person I was in the most conflict with, we got together, we were both on a spiritual path, and we shared our view of each other, and we discovered it was exactly the same.
Mm.
We both had the same story. You're being arrogant, you're not listening to me, you're trying to be right. And we looked at each other and we had this moment. And then I realized that all of that, if I'm open to it, and this is where the last 24 hours was me honestly in the fetal position crying and realizing that these wounds were very, very early. It wasn't about this situation. It was about the very, very deep wounds from early childhood and maybe even from past incarnations where I was feeling this pain and this generational trauma that I knew was being burnt off and being cleansed because I realized that it wasn't for me to run from it anymore through all of my facades, all of my strategies, all of my addictions, that I needed to lean in. And then I woke up on that fourth day free, completely free.
Mm.
Doesn't mean it's been gone forever. And I think that's important. But there was a sense of freedom that came with shifting from shame to accountability, right? I moved out of the I'm broken because this happened or I did this. I moved out of that victim. I moved out of believing that I was my personality or my ego and stepped into this new way of being. So that's really the little bit longer version of what happened in those 72 hours.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. I think it's so important to let people in on that because, for a few reasons. And one is that you specifically are held as, this being of light and love, which you are. Um, and I think that it's easy for us to forget that we all have a shadow and we all have a past. And I think, even when I tell people my story of addiction before I got into recovery, people look at me and they're like, Jeremy, I can't see you like that. I can't picture you as like this drunken buffoon or, being cruel or mean. And that's kind of the point, is that there's this shadow. And like Brene Brown speaks to so well, that shame grows in the darkness. And so while we're all trying to navigate this experience that we're in, um, there is a shadow present, and it can be real easy for people to look at us as we are now and assume that's how we've always been. And I think one of the things I love about recovery itself specifically is that, I mean, so many of us have a story like that, where when we look back, it's like, oh man, like, yeah, it got wild back there. And because and as you named, like, that the dark night of the soul isn't the entire process, it's the door opening to the process. I think that's a really powerful metaphor for recovery, because when people enter treatment, like residential treatment, for example, we often speak to the fact that this is just kind of like, we're just getting the door open. But the journey is not just abstaining from drugs and alcohol. It's really fostering that connection with who and what we truly are, what we're truly here to be. And I
Yeah.
think that hearing about your experience specifically is really powerful, because a lot of times it'd be easy to kind of spiritually bypass that stuff and say, oh, Reverend TJ, yeah, he's just this amazing spiritual guru who wrote this amazing book. And I personally love hearing that story, because it's like, wow, cool. Like, TJ has a shadow just like me.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, like, to point to conscious recovery, the authenticity group specifically, it is letting each other into the shadow to experience closeness, not
Yeah.
separateness.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, because I do think that sometimes people like spiritual teachers to be on a pedestal and be perfect. And the truth is, we all are perfect, essentially. And we've all done all sorts of things, on planet Earth. Eckhart Tolle, in one of his books, I believe it's in A New Earth, says that many spiritual teachers had a very dense ego early in life. And I was like, what does that mean? And I understand, because I got to experience, and I mean this, I got to experience what happens when my ego is in charge. And I got to experience it in a very painful and public way. And I got to experience what it's like to have a lot of stuff projected on me, good, bad, and ugly. And I got to experience what happened when it touched a wound, and when it touched shame, and when I went into hiding, and when I went into secrecy, and when I tried to defend. There is a process, and it comes from multiple sources that I've made it my own. So I know that there are several books that have been written that use a similar process. So I want to be clear, I didn't create this, but the process I use is when something happens that, we formally might have called a trigger. If someone says something, if someone has a judgment of me, if someone cuts me off in traffic, something as small as that, or something as big as, someone points a finger and accuses me of something. Step one is to pause and to really deeply feel it, and to feel it as long as I can possibly feel it, or until it subsides. So like, oh, I feel the sting, I feel the wash of shame. I feel the anger. I feel the sadness. I feel the defensiveness. And I sit with that and allow myself to feel it as long as I possibly can. And then I pause and I go within and reconnect with source energy. And then I recognize and I acknowledge and I say to myself, the ego or the defense or the feeling or the judgment or the strategy is not who I am. Who I am is one with the divine. Who I am is an infinite being. Then I get into that energy. And then the next step is I thank the sender, because the sender gave me the opportunity to see where there's a little place that needed some healing. Right. And when I move into that way of being, then I no longer am afraid of anyone or anything. Now, let me be clear. The process for me often is this beautiful experience, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes I go, oh, I notice myself defending, and then I'm like, okay, what am I really feeling? Okay, I'm feeling shame. I'm feeling sadness. I'm feeling pain. Allow myself to feel it. Allow that feeling to pass through me, reconnect with my true nature, and then thank the situation or the person for the opportunity for a deeper healing.
Mm. That's beautiful. I'm wondering, as we look at the dark night of the soul, and those 2 years and the 72 hours, clearly from that point in time until now, there has been this massive transformation.
Right.
Do you feel that transformation was only possible because of the process you went through with the dark night of the soul?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. There's no doubt. There's no doubt in my mind. And that's why I can genuinely say thank you, to the situation. Thank you to everything that happened. I could even say thank you to my own ego for causing harm, for having to clean it up, for being judged, for judging myself, for judging others. Thank you, all of that, because it gave me the opportunity to shed that. And if we think about the dark night of the soul, another way to say it that's really simple is if you take a seed and you put it out in the sun, nothing's going to grow because it gets burnt, right? It's too much light. So look at the metaphor. There's too much light, it's going to get burnt. So I couldn't move from where I was at to where I'm at today with a sense of a deeper awareness of my purpose and my oneness with all living beings, because that sun would have burnt it off. We have to put the seed in the soil, and it has to be in the dark for a while. And it has to be in the right conditions. And those conditions are darkness for a while. And so that's a great metaphor, because I couldn't actually step more fully into my light or my purpose until I embraced my darkness. Now, here's another little side benefit, if you will. The greatest paradox, or maybe irony is a better word, is the darkness itself has become my purpose, right? Because I went through that, I can now be present with someone else going through that without a lot of judgment. And if I do have judgment, I can catch myself in return. Because I went through that intense experience, it made me uniquely available. After that experience is when I started working in the addiction treatment field. All of that happened. The intense experience was in 2006 in India. 2007 was when my whole world fell apart. 2008 was when I started working in the field of addiction treatment. And there was still a lot, left over from the old consciousness, but I had shifted and I had realized that in my embracing my own shame and my own trauma, my own fear, my own guilt, in embracing that and being in the process of healing it, I realized, oh my gosh, that's my purpose. My purpose is to be a presence to allow other people to have that experience and walk them through that, not fix them, not try to make them feel better, because that's what you're talking about with the spiritual bypass, but to really hold space that someone can heal. Working in this field, we sit in front of people telling us horrific things, right? Terrible things that have happened to them, terrible things they've done. I worked with a client, and obviously I'm not going to give any details, but I worked with her for 3 years. And in the end, she told me something that she had done that by anyone's judgment was horrific. And she had never, ever, ever told a soul. And it was literally eating her soul. And I'd worked with her for 3 years before she had the courage to say, this is what I did. It was horrible. And then the healing could start because she brought it into the light, right? She was able to embrace that. And the reality is, and maybe we can switch gears a little bit, the reality is, when I do that healing, when she did that healing, when we do that healing, we end up not perpetuating more drama on planet Earth, right? And if I don't do the healing, then I look for it everywhere. And I think that's really an important thing to bring into the conversation, because if I feel broken, I unconsciously look for brokenness in the world, in the form of blame, in the form of drama, in the form of finger pointing. So I think that's also an interesting part of the conversation. But as I'm telling this story and I'm thinking of her, and I'm thinking of the things that I've done in my past, and the things that have happened that I thought were so horrific, I'm feeling this great sense of sadness and gratitude at the same time, because there's a surrender of, wow, that came to the surface. It's authentic, it's transparent. And then I can start to shift into recognizing that, yeah, sometimes we have to be accountable, and sometimes the accountability is really painful, but the deeper work is actually the moving out of shame and reconnecting with our true nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think what I what I'm really curious about, because like you mentioned, working in this field, we hear terrible things that happen to people, that people do, um, and we get to see people drop beneath that and reconnect with who and what they truly are, and then go out into the world vibrating from that frequency. And I mean, talk about a difference, right? And so I think one of the things I wanted to explore in our time tonight was the process of transcending out of ego and story and this perception of who and what we're supposed to be, and what that process looks like. Because I feel that 2020 itself gave this amazing opportunity for all this stillness, all the silence, and all this stuff individually, culturally, globally, came skyrocketing to the surface. And so I'm curious now, what does the work look like, of accepting and transcending from the detachment and what we've learned about ourselves? What does that process of stepping into vision actually look and feel like?
Well, a wise person once said, my friend Patricia Keel, she said, there are 3 steps to this. Step 1, awareness. Step 2, awareness. And step 3, awareness. Right? So to be aware of what's really happening. And, there was this amazing and very simple litmus test that someone gave me to let you know, or let me know if I'm in my ego. And it was very simple. I know I'm in my ego if I'm easily offended. Right? And I've used that as a guide. Oh, whoa, look, I just got offended. I just felt like defending. I went into defense mode. I went into judgment mode. I went into reaction. So that is, first of all, just the way to first even see. So that first step of awareness is I'm aware I'm in my ego, right? I'm aware I'm offended. And what happens for most of us on planet Earth, most of us aren't aware of that. And then we start defending, and then we start finger pointing, and then we start blaming. Now, it's a nuanced conversation, right? Because what has come up in our culture, I think of the Me Too movement, I think of Black Lives Matter, I think of all these incredible things that have come up for us to deal with and to work with. And there needs to be accountability. And then where's the fine line between accountability and blame and shame, right? So I do think that one of the conversations that I have really loved in 2020 was people saying, gently and lovingly, most of the time, I'm not asking you to call anyone out. I'm asking you to pause and look within and see how you're contributing to this. Right. And I heard that, I heard that in a conversation I was in. And I realized very deeply that the reason that we want to call someone else out or point to someone else's drama or rehash an old story is something that's unhealed within us. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just an awareness that I'm in my ego. And then the shift is, it's not who I am. And I can then move within and ask myself, because when I have a judgment, because I have judgments, right? It's like, I think sometimes people talk about, I had a good friend, she said, I wish spiritual teachers would stop framing that they are always, in this love and light experience, that they're also human beings, right? And I had a client say to me, are you always walking around just feeling deeply connected, at one with the universe, in love with everyone? And my answer is yes, I am always walking around that way, but I don't always remember that. Right. And so that's our true nature. That's the truth of who we are. We're open, we're one, we want to connect, we want to love, but we have all these defenses that we've built up. And so when I'm able to recognize that facade that is the ego and allow myself, rather than pointing a finger, to come back and feel what it is that's wanting to heal. Because see, we think we're not supposed to have wounds or not have them touched, or there's something wrong. But I look at it now as like, oh, wow, I'm having this emotional response that I once would have called negative. But now I'm like, oh, I wonder what's wanting to heal right now. And so we're not doing the spiritual bypass. I'm accountable for what I'm feeling. And then I allow myself to actually return to my true nature.
Yeah. And what's that quote, TJ, about how there are many paths in the future, but behind us only one? How does that quote go?
The master knows that looking forward, there are endless possibilities. Looking back, there was only one.
And I love that. I feel like that quote by itself has kept me busy for 2 weeks since I heard it.
Yeah.
Largely because I think it's really easy culturally to look back and say, oh, if only this or if only that, or, and we're constantly looking behind us at what could or should have been and looking ahead at what we hope will be, and rarely at just simply what is right now in this moment. And I think that one of the big turning points for me last year was I would be feeling this overwhelming sense of confusion about who I am and what I'm doing and why I'm here. And I was trying to do my way out of all this stuff. I'd Google, what do I do when I don't know who I am, right? Seeking all this external resource. And I remember telling you about that. And you said, well, maybe it's time to just be with it. And so there were countless days last year where I would literally just sit for 4 hours, not with my eyes closed or meditating or anything proper, but just sitting to be with what's coming up. And there's this infinite amount of wisdom that happened when I did absolutely nothing.
Right.
And I think that that's a really, really powerful part of the process, because without that, there's no awareness, which I feel is key to transcending out of the dark night of the soul.
Yeah. And, I'm reminded of my wonderful Mary Helen, who was my first spiritual teacher and such a beautiful being. She would say confusion is the highest spiritual state.
Mhm.
And because I would say I really don't understand, or I don't know what to do here, or I'm confused about why this is happening, whatever it was. And I asked her, well, what does that mean? And basically the answer was, because confusion is acknowledging that I don't have the answer. And when I shift from needing to know to being curious, my entire life changed. And it's a moment to moment thing, right? There's no finish line like, oh, I got that, right? So I've got it. Now I'm not going to ever try to come up with any other answers or try to, move into action. I'm going to just always be in curiosity. No, it's a moment to moment reminder. And the more aware I am, and I think when you're talking about those 4 hours of just sitting with yourself, the more aware we become of what's actually happening in our bodies, then I can notice when I tighten up. And then I can say, oh, look, see, we become the observer. And that's the ultimate state. Eckhart Tolle talks about it. A lot of spiritual teachers talk about it. We become the observer of the ego. The ego doesn't go away. And then I say, oh, isn't that interesting that I'm judging? Isn't that interesting that I had a place I wanted to defend? Isn't it interesting I want to pick up the phone and call someone to defend my position? Isn't it interesting?
Mhm.
Right. And then I can view it, I can look at it, and I can see it for what it is. It's a story. It's a collection of ideas and beliefs that I once believed was reality, when in truth, that's the illusion. And the illusion has been created collectively and individually for thousands of years. So to untangle from that and unlearn that does, I think, it seems, at least looking back, there was only one possibility. I needed to go through the dark night of the soul in order to transform. Otherwise, I think I would have just kept trying to manage it, do it my way, push myself through it. Um, Fear was activating almost every decision I was making in my life
Mhm.
until I realized the pain that was creating.
Absolutely. And I think one of my favorite takeaways in our early work together was we were speaking about, major loss. When people experience a big loss, whether it be death of a family member or loss of a job or a breakup in a relationship. Um, and it's kind of the ego's automated response is seemingly to go into this massive hole that it's created, this crater that now exists where this amazing, beautiful thing once was.
Mm,
And I remember explaining that to you, and you said that sometimes what's truly trying to emerge needs a lot of space.
mm,
And I just love that. And I think that, little things like that, just little shifts in our perspective and our perception can make all the difference when it comes to experiencing these really painful times or really big losses. That, yes, like honoring what we feel and honoring the loss and all of the emotions that come with it, and recognizing that sometimes whatever's trying to come through needs a little room.
yeah.
And when I learned that, every subsequent loss afterwards, I would feel very deeply,
Mm,
and I would bring a lot of honor to those feelings.
right.
And in the back of my mind, I held true that what's truly trying to emerge now has the space to do it.
Oh, that's amazing. That's such a great story, Jeremy. I love that because, most of us have been running from actually just experiencing what we're experiencing. We go into a story. I remember, and I've shared this story before on different shows, but I had two Chihuahuas, 15 years, 16 years, and they both died in the same year. And when they died, I allowed myself to grieve. Our second one we put down, we made that decision. It was time. We did a beautiful ceremony in our home. We brought someone in to do it. And we just grieved. Will and I just sobbed and cried and grieved. And then I found myself through that. And I was into the gratitude for these beautiful dogs that had been in our life for all these years. And so many people were kept saying, I'm so sorry. You must be so sad. And I wasn't, because I had done the grieving. And I'm not saying that because like, oh, I'm such a good griever. I'm saying that because if I allow myself to be really present with what is and allow myself to actually move through it, we do return to our natural state, which is joy. If that's true, that that's our natural state, we allow ourselves to feel. I'm thinking about my friends who wrote a book called How We Choose to Be Happy. And they studied truly happy people. And one of the qualities of truly happy people is that they feel their feelings very deeply.
Mm.
And that seems paradoxical to some people because we might believe that we're supposed to be happy all the time in order to be happy. But the truth is, if there's a breakup, if there's a loss, if there's a death, we often feel sad. And it's the resistance to that sadness that actually creates the unhappiness. It's going through it that actually creates true happiness.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful way to bring the show to a close tonight. I think for me, my takeaways are really looking at this kind of collective dark night of the soul and looking at all the beautiful people I'm connected with, and really just holding space for the fact that um, that if our default position is joy, that the resistance of the pain, or the shoving it down into the shadow or trying to get it under the rug, is only going to perpetuate this state of pain. And I
Right.
think that it's so powerful. It's empowering for me to know that even though there may be darkness in the past and pain in the past, that as we move forward and transcend beyond it, that what can be created, when we can step into the highest vision of our life, it wouldn't be possible without that stuff behind us.
For
And I
sure.
think that's a really empowering takeaway.
Wow. Thank you, Jeremy. And that absolutely is true. It's like I tried for the first 40 years of my life to do it my way. And there were some really amazing experiences from that. I think it's Carl Jung that says we spend the first 40 years of our life trying to build a healthy ego, and the second 40 years trying to dismantle it. And that's a paraphrase, but that's at least my interpretation. And that kind of ironically, if you will, that's when all the stuff that was my dark night of the soul experience around the age 40. I have to actually look at a calendar to see when I turned 40, but it was definitely at that time when all of that was emerging and was being brought up. And what you're really speaking to, and I do think this is a beautiful way to close, is once we get through all of that, and once I walked through all of that dark night of the soul, then I began to cultivate a profound relationship with the inner wisdom, which we all have. But I had spent so many years putting all this stuff on top of it that I could no longer hear the voice. I couldn't hear that. I was being run from the programs of I'm not good enough, I'm broken, I'm damaged. So of course I was acting like I'm not good enough, I'm broken, I'm damaged. And then I caused more of that. I caused more damage in my life and the lives around me. And it was this whirlwind, and the energy around the way I'm speaking about it is how it felt. I was constantly like this. And then like I finally, everything, oh my God, it all fell apart.
Mm.
Now I can start cultivating a relationship with my inner knowing. And then that inner wisdom is so much more of a powerful creator than anything my ego mind would have created. Everything that's happened in my life with conscious recovery, being able to be a beneficial presence on the planet. Because, when I was in my 30s, the goal was to be fabulous. The goal was to be recognized. The goal was to look good. The goal was to have people love me or like me. And now my intention is to be a beneficial presence on the planet.
Mm.
And that in itself, reminding myself of that and listening to that inner wisdom, it will guide me toward that, even when my thoughts come in and, oh, I should do this. No, wait, listen to the inner wisdom. And that's when we start living life very deeply on purpose.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, TJ. And coincidentally, you've got me really excited to turn 40. So at least I have that to look forward to.
You have a while. You have a while for that. Yeah.
We got a ways, but listen, thank you so much. I was super excited for this show, because like you mentioned at some point during our time tonight, I feel like people in the spiritual realms, whether it's New Thought or what have you, even people in recovery, long-term recovery, it can be easy to hold them at an elevation where it's like, oh, you're 15 years sober, it's probably so easy for you.
Right.
right? Oh, you're a spiritual minister. You're probably just levitating everywhere you go. And I like bringing this kind of conversation to the table because I feel like it helps us tap into our humanity, and also for everybody that's with us watching or that watches later, tap into theirs too. And I feel like doing that is just really cultivating a lot of connection.
Yeah, and then I do know what I want to say in closing. You know, we have been talking about the shift from believing that we're human beings having a spiritual experience. And some hundreds of years ago, we shifted that to spiritual beings having a human experience. And what I see us doing now and being now and moving into now is a spiritual being having a spiritual experience. And what I mean by that is everything that's ever happened, everything I've ever done, everything I've ever been ashamed of or proud of has all been spiritual, right? It's no longer like, oh, this human part of me has done this. It's in the shadow. I'm not going to address that or look at that because that's what comes up and causes all the discord and the discomfort and the harm. Being a spiritual being having a spiritual experience means I welcome it all. So the pain and the joy are equal for my spiritual transformation. And then I'm in a place in the world where it's like, oh, wow, I don't need to cling to, I want more of this and less of that, which is what the Buddhist definition of suffering it is. I can move into a state or an awareness of open and present curiosity. And then I'm no longer a victim to the conditions of the world. It doesn't mean I don't have emotions or perspectives or feelings. It does mean, oh, wow, I remind myself that that's not who I am. I am not my past. I need to be accountable for my past, but it's not who I am. And that's a total game changer.
Awesome. Couldn't have said it better myself, TJ. Thank you so much for tonight. We had a lot of people watching. Thank you all for joining us. And comment below. Let us know what you think. And I love going through the comments after these and just kind of seeing people reflect. So please do let us know what you think in the comments. And of course, we will probably do more lives like this, I'm sure. But we're grateful you spent some time with us on this beautiful Wednesday. TJ, thank you again so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.